You have migrants who are in I believe it's a 4-star hotel. Perhaps it's a 3-star. So there may not be an indoor pool and room service, but it's a nice hotel in Midtown, and they've been living there for weeks, perhaps months, at taxpayer expense, and they have been asked to change facilities. Does anyone want to take a guess as to whether the people who came into the country knowingly and illegally to abuse our system to pretend to be asylum seekers who have been put up in hotels in the middle of Manhattan at taxpayer expense, does anyone want to guess if they're really eager to comply with the request to move to another facility? We'll just put that one out there for a second.
It's not only a hotel, Buck. It's a 4-star hotel.
It is a 4-star. Okay.
How many people listening to us right now have ever stayed in a 4-star hotel in Manhattan? Like, a 4-star hotel in Manhattan is, $200+ a night, depending
200.
on.
Whoa.
Yeah.
More like $350 and up, my friend. $350
old man
and up.
here. But my point is, it's super expensive. And, the idea that we're putting them up in these places, I'm not surprised they would leave. Like, if you told me I could stay in a 4-star hotel in Manhattan for a couple of weeks in a row, I'd be like, that's a pretty good deal. I don't want to leave either.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this a little bit, because I think people are seeing more and more, the more visible illegal immigration and what it does to the communities where it is concentrated. Just from we don't even talk about what it means for the polity, assimilation, rule of law. Just on an economic, dollars and cents perspective, it's worth looking at how expensive this is for the taxpayer. The northern border, though, we usually think of the southern border. Do you see this, Clay? The northern border has had a 700+% spike in migrants trying to cross. So between October 1st and December 31st of last year, the Border Patrol covering Vermont and New Hampshire. You don't often think of that as a Border Patrol sector, but it is one. They have even seen a 7x surge. Now, the numbers are far smaller than what you're dealing with at the U.S.-Mexico border, obviously. You're looking more along the lines of the hundreds instead of the thousands or hundreds of thousands that have been crossing. But it's interesting just to see that it's now from both sides. You have an illegal immigration relative surge. It's enormous at our southern border by any standard, but as a percentage, a dramatic increase, because people realize that the Biden administration is not going to do anything about any of this.
Yeah, so, there was a story, Buck, to speak of this. Do you know how many Russians have come across our southern border?
A bunch?
35,000 Russians have traveled to the southern border because, I know this because there was a story in, it's interesting you mentioned the northern border. There was a story in the New York Times Sunday edition about 2 Russians who came in through Alaska. They went to one of the small island outposts of the United States. They fled from Russia and have claimed asylum. But the story was about the number of Russians who have entered into the country and claimed asylum because of the war that's going on. And the New York Times number, I believe, 35,000 coming across the southern border, which was a staggering number to me. I know we've talked about how many different countries people are coming to Mexico and just deciding to walk across the southern border and claim asylum. 35,000 Russians was a jaw-dropping number to me. And they just fly to Mexico, basically, and then walk right across the border.
Since we're talking jaw-dropping numbers, 5 million immigrants, illegal immigrants, have entered the United States since January of 2021 when Joe Biden took over. 5 million in 2 years. Okay? So as we're looking at the data now, we're looking at the numbers. How much more open could the border be? And you'll notice the Biden administration doesn't feel any urgency on this issue, isn't going to do anything other than every time they say they're going to surge resources, particularly at our southern border, every time they claim that they're paying attention to it. It's just to add processing so that people can be more easily and readily let into the United States. Think about it this way, everyone. They're all saying, Clay, that they're asylum seekers. This is how they gain. This is the giant gaping hole in our system that has been exploited. And it's really immoral. I mean, I will say that this idea that you can lie about being persecuted from your home country so you can skip to the front of the immigration line. There are people for whom getting asylum is a life and death issue. These are not individuals. 99% of them, more than that, are not actually asylum seekers. And the data bears all this out. The actual numbers about who's going to get asylum, maybe 1 in 10 will get some form of status given to them. And that's probably high. But Clay, you have to wonder, at what point does the Biden administration recognize that this is unsustainable if we're going to pretend to even have a border? Why even go through the motions?
Buck, and I'm glad you brought up that 5 million number, because I was thinking about this the other day. You think about numbers and sometimes you don't contextualize them, and I know I do this sometimes too. Let me give you a context for what 5 million means in a way that I think a lot of people out there could understand. Basically, since Joe Biden became president, the entire state of South Carolina we have added in population. So if you have ever been to the state of South Carolina, about 5.2 million people, every single person in South Carolina right now is how many people walked across the border. Alabama, 5 million people. More people have come into this country illegally under Joe Biden than live in Louisiana, Kentucky, Oregon, Oklahoma, Connecticut, Utah, Iowa, a lot more, Nevada, Arkansas, Mississippi. I mean, think about when you talk about 5 million people, you're talking about the entire state of Alabama or South Carolina and populations that are more substantial than over basically half of the populations in the United States right now. That's crazy to think about.
This is all on the premise, because what the activists and the left wing will say is they're allowed to be here. They're seeking legal status through the asylum system. How long does anyone think it would take to process millions of asylum claims in any sort of real way? Meaning you're going to figure out who this person is, have them prove their story, give them their day in court over asylum. The way increasingly, I think the way the Biden administration is going to push for amnesty is a backdoor amnesty where they're just going to try to make it so that what's going on at the border is the credible fear test that Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement do, where you have to say very, very minimal things to be, I'm now seeking defensive asylum in the U.S. They've decided that they're not going to detain people, which is against the law, by the way, but they don't care, and they let them into the country. Clay, if they make it super easy to effectively get a rubber stamp asylum claim done, that's a test. That's a switch that they could have just from the system without necessarily getting any change in legislation. I think that's something they're hoping to accomplish, because the Republicans in the House, I don't believe, will go along with a mass amnesty through legislation. So they've exploited the holes in the system to let them in, to let them all stay indefinitely. I think they're going to do the same thing. Obama administration essentially did a version of this, but they weren't doing it through the immigration courts. They were doing it by they were going to hand out IDs and work visas to everybody who was coming in, who was the family member of a DACA recipient. I think it was DACA and DAPA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, Deferred Action for the Parents of Arrivals. It was going to be like 7 million people, something like that they were just going to give up. So this is what we're heading toward. 5 million people. How can you even process that if you wanted to?
I just think, again, to contextualize, over half of American states have a population that is smaller than that number, basically. So if you think about it from an Alabama or South Carolina perspective, and remember, it's going to grow. It'll move into, during this Biden administration, next 2 years, it will move into, probably a top 10, top 12, top 14 state population, wherever you're listening to us right now, during Joe Biden's tenure, your state population, there's a good chance around 25 states have 5 million people, 5.2 million people or fewer. That contextualizes it. And, a state like Wyoming, Buck, has 600,000 people. So you basically have had 10 Wyomings enter since Joe Biden became president.
And if you're wondering, remember the old storyline we used to hear about illegal immigrants was always, they do the jobs Americans won't do. They contribute to the economy. They're going to save Social Security. These are all the old Democrat talking points. Meanwhile, you speak to Eric Adams or any large city mayor right now with the influx of migrants they have, and what do they all say? We can't afford this. We can't afford to pay for the housing, the food, effectively the room and board of these migrant groups. And so that's why we mentioned this in the last hour. In Hell's Kitchen, New York City, they have a hotel where there are migrants who have been housed, and they are refusing. This is on West 57th Street, the Watson Hotel. The migrants were told, Clay, they should move to the Brooklyn cruise ship terminal where they've set up a facility for migrants. And they're protesting outside the hotel where they're staying at taxpayer expense, saying, "No, we like the 4-star hotel. I think we're going to stay here. We don't want to go to the other place." This is the mentality, everybody. This is what's going on, and you are paying for it.
If you wonder why people are coming, imagine that you are living incredibly poor in Latin America, and one of your friends or family members texts you and says, "Hey, I'm in New York City now, right off Times Square, in a 4-star hotel. I got cable. I got, heating, air, great bathroom. This is how rich the United States is. They're just putting us up in hotels that are probably nicer than almost any hotels that exist in many of the countries where these guys are coming from." Do you think that's going to persuade you that you shouldn't come? Or are you going to be like, this is amazing? And remember, they also probably got a free bus ride to New York City from Texas, too, right? On top of everything else, you came across illegally, and you say, okay, where would you like to go? And you're like, New York City, and you get popped on a bus. Next thing you know, you're in New York City staying in a 4-star hotel. Again, I just question how many people in our listening audience have ever gotten to stay in a 4-star hotel in Manhattan, much less our taxpayers paying for it. It's crazy.
I'm an American citizen, and if I showed up to a 4-star hotel, and I've been paying taxes for a long time, haven't gotten very much for it. If I showed up at a 4-star hotel and said, I'm going to stay here for free and have people bring me food for free, and I get to do whatever I want, and this is now my home, I assume hotel management would call the police and I would be arrested, right? Like that would just be my assumption. Now, I know they've been told by the government authorities that they can stay here, but now they're being told you got to go, and they're saying, no, we're going to actually try to just stay here at taxpayer expense. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, everybody. Can I also just put that out there? This is not a small amount of money that the city of New York is spending to house these migrants. And this is why it was only that one time, but when the migrants were dropped off in Martha's Vineyard
lost its mind, yeah.
I'm sorry. Nantucket. Oh, my gosh. The Vineyard people are like, how dare you? It was Nantucket, wasn't it?
I think it was Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, no, it was the Vineyard.
I think you're right the first time. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So when they were dropped off on one of those fancy islands, it showed you what's really going on.
50 people is all it took.
Yeah, that's all it took. It's amazing that this is what ended up happening.
I can't get over Buck. I mean, again, for anybody out there who's listening to us, 4-star hotel in the heart of Manhattan, your taxpayer dollars are going to put illegal immigrants in 4-star hotels in the heart of Manhattan. And what percentage of you listening to us right now could afford to go on a vacation right now and stay in a 4-star hotel in the heart of Manhattan? I bet not a huge percentage, right? Take your whole family, travel there. You'd have to pay for all of it. Illegal immigrants are doing it on your taxpayer dollars. It's staggering.
I just want to know what's the and what is the these are people who are really not supposed to be in the country at all. And can they live in this? Can they live in at taxpayer expense for 2 years, for 5 years? You know, how long do they put up in this hotel for? How long are taxpayers on the hook for this? It's amazing what the Democrats are doing.
They're protesting because they don't want it to end, but think about what the incentive structure you are sending for people in poor countries who hear that this is what happens when you come to America. Wouldn't you travel if you had an awful existence in a Latin American country and you heard you could stay in a 4-star hotel in New York City? I mean, the incentive structure is completely broken.
If I were a New Yorker who had been evicted from my house or my home in the last 6 months, I would be really, really angry. Because, you didn't pay the bank, so you have to go. But other people are getting free housing, a taxpayer. For what? On what basis? They're not even supposed to be in the country.